Well, first, I guess I would bask in my ultimate power as energy dictator. Maybe I would create an office of lifestyle changes or something that looks for ways to match what we need to do with what is going to make people's lives better.
The Office of Lifestyle Changes sounds like a conservative nightmare.
No. It's exactly what they want, is to have that, because it'll be red meat that allows them to win the next election.
There you go. I got to give it a better name.
Yeah.
The Office of Making People Happier and enabling them to make choices, right? Because I think that's the other thing is our
chocolate rations have gone up. Chocolate rations have gone up again, folks. David, what do you think?
Nobody wants me as Sara. That's pretty clear.
It's a good thing we're not actually politicians.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to the Season 2 finale of Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to check out our back catalog, register for updates, and get exclusive access to join our live webinars. On today's show, we revisit some of the topics we've covered on previous episodes and answer outstanding audience questions about net zero oil sands, carbon capture, nuclear, enhanced oil recovery, the electricity grid, and our grand vision for Canada's energy future. This is our last episode of the season, but we'll be back in September with more guests, more debate, and more solutions for the energy transition. In the meantime, we're looking to you, our listeners, to help us make next season even better. So subscribe at energyversusclimate.com and watch for an audience survey coming to your inbox later this summer. Thanks, and now on to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of Energy vs. Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. In season 2, in the last several months, we covered a whole bunch of topics to do with energy and climate. We covered Canada's new climate plan, if you remember, with Mark Jacquard. We covered decarbonizing transportation with Amy Myers-Jaffe, energy system and climate models with Ken Caldera, and decarbonizing heavy industry with Thomas Cote-Blanc. But in each of these episodes, we find that we never cover as many of the questions from our audience as we would have liked. So for this very last episode of season 2, FYI, we'll be back in September 2021 for season 3. We're
Back to the future.
We don't have a time machine yet, although
we're working on it.
Up later on. We're working on it. We're going to set aside the whole episode just to take questions that you've submitted in advance. So what we did is on social media and through our email registration, we said, hey, give us questions. You gave us questions. We grouped them. We picked themes, and then we've assigned to each of us one of those question themes. And you'll see that contrary to a normal show, we'll be passing the moderator hat around for this one. So we'll go through those questions for however long it takes. So let's get started. Without any further ado, over to David to moderate this first section.
So this month, there was an announcement of the Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero initiative. It follows on a host of corporate net zero commitments. It's hard to even think of a company. I'm sure there's net zero dog food, although I can't name a brand. Here's what Sonia Savage, Alberta's Minister of Energy, said. The Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero initiative is an industry-driven, made-in-Alberta solution that will strengthen our position as global ESG leaders. So, Sara, do you see us as global ESG leaders? What do you make of these corporate commitments?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things in there, as you say. What does it mean to be an ESG leader? And as we talked about, I feel like this is an echo back to one of our very early shows and the op-ed that we wrote in the Globe, looking at, is there an ESG case for Alberta's oil sands? And I think one thing that we touched on there was this idea that the environment piece and the social and governance piece, it's kind of hard to add those up. How do you, add up an environment score and a social and governance score and get a total score? How do you balance the environmental impact with, what happens socially? And that's kind of, I would say hard to do is almost an understatement. I don't even know that that's really possible to do. And that really what's going on right now is that you have investors and a world that's increasingly really focused on climate. And so, is Alberta a leader in the climate space, and does the net zero commitments make Alberta a leader? I think that pretty clear the answer I would say is no. In the same week that these commitments came out, you had Shell, in a court case.
I mean, Sarah, aren't you understanding? It's not no, it's hell no, rolling on the floor laughing, no, not even close.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's fair. Like I'll borrow your language. But
if I poll climate leaders around the world, and serious people, not just the activist fringe, but the people really in the middle of the climate, how many people think Alberta is a leader on low carbon energy or carbon transition?
Yeah, I don't think that there's really a case to be made there, right? And you just look at Shell being told by the court in the Netherlands that they need to have a net zero target that includes scope 3, includes the emissions from the products that they produce, and that's not part of the Alberta company's zero emissions target. So I mean, it's really, I think people also sometimes confuse. There's a lot of effort that's been going on within companies to find ways to reduce emissions, and I think that's really true. But that doesn't mean that if you start with a high carbon product, that just because you put a lot of effort in that you're a leader.
Ed, over to you. You had something to say about Suncor.
Well, I've got a few things to say, but are we a leader? Well, let's just say a net zero commitment these days, it's like table stakes at the ESG table. Like you have to make it. And these days, I think if you have any hope of trying to attract capital to your projects, you have to say, yes, I've got this net zero plan. The irony, and at the risk of sounding like an old fart, is when I was at the Pembina Institute, we published a report in 2006 saying that the oil sands could be carbon neutral by 2020. And we actually ran the cost implications. And basically it came down to a ramp up of CCS and offsets. Now, and the cost range on a per barrel basis, it could be, if you're buying crappy offsets, a couple bucks per barrel to upwards of $13, $15 per barrel. We got laughed out of the room at that time. But the bottom line, I think the bottom line remains the same today, that it's hard to produce a low cost, low carbon barrel of oil if your starting point is high cost and high carbon. And that's the starting point right now for many of the oil sands producers.
And David, one other piece I just wanted to pick out of that quote is the industry driven, right? And I think that's a big important part of this too, is sort of where is the money coming from for these things? If this is something that industry is picking up and going to do in a major way, under the influence of the carbon price and things like that, that's one story. If it's here's our plan and we want somebody else to pay for the majority of it, that's a different story.
Yeah, I had a friend who joked, he said, this is great. It's a pledge to do good subject to boatloads of public cash. And to be clear, and I disclose, I'm in this business, if you're talking about net zero in the oil sands, you're talking about some ramp up of carbon capture, which is difficult because there's high concentration CO2 streams. There's really low concentration CO2 streams. There's not the infrastructure right now. And to do that, the companies aren't going to get to there just through carbon price alone. They're going to look for a handout.
It's a pledge to do good in the distant future. It's like saying, I promise that I'll stop beating my kids, 30 years in the future, but only beating them more. I mean, here's my take on sort of the big picture of these things. I think that the technologies that enable reduction in environmental harm come out of industry in general, and industry is fundamental to doing that. But the idea that industrial commitments, sort of vague commitments absent law, changes what happens, I think history shows no. So we have in the rich world made enormous progress on a host of environmental problems, toxic metals like lead, water pollution, air pollution, global ozone, and all those things. We made huge progress. It's not like we can't clean up the environment in the middle of capitalism. We absolutely can. I would say none of them did voluntary consumer or corporate action play a major role. In all, the fundamental driver of the actual transition, the driver, was regulation. But it's not like regulation does it in a vacuum. Regulation does it when there are technologies, and those technologies come out of industry. And so I think these things mean something. They basically mean effectively, we're more okay to be regulated. We're not as upset about being regulated as we used to be. That's really what's being said.
And agree. I think, it's all going to come down to regulations. Some of them can be flexible, and carbon pricing. One thing that net zero oil sands alliance, whatever they're calling themselves, I think it overshadowed an individual commitment. You'd asked me about Suncor, David. So Suncor's commitment, its 2030 commitment, I thought was actually more noteworthy and praiseworthy, because what it said is we're going to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions by 10 megatons per year by 2030 from current 29 megatons. And that's an absolute reduction, because when you actually look into these commitments, and even if they're incentivized by executive pay, a lot of them are just intensity improvements. And to be clear, half of that reduction is going to come from somewhere completely else. They're going to build a new wind farm and they'll, get carbon value and offsets, et cetera. But half of that is actually going to come from upstream GHG emissions. And that's carbon capture, fuel switching, and efficiency. So given that's much nearer term, that's 9 years away, whether these producers have a snowball's chance in hell of getting to net zero, at least now we've got a milestone along the way that's much nearer term to see if it's even doable.
Quick last word to you, Sarah, on this topic, then we're going to switch topics.
Yeah, so the other thing that I think is noteworthy about the announcement is who was there and who wasn't, right? And I think this is sort of a group that is stepping away from CAP, or has, done this without CAP as part of it. And I think that is, potentially also an important sign of, what's going on within the industry, where you have a range of players who are, better or worse positioned to take on a challenge like this.
All right, next topic. So we got a whole host of questions. Thank you, audience, very much. And we got lots of questions that were somehow related to CCS or to nuclear power. So we've decided to lump them together. And here's the reason to do that. Think about CCS and nuclear. They both come in really large unit sizes, inherently large unit sizes with high capital cost, big projects. They both have inherently long construction and long permitting times. They're both high capacity factors. They're available most of the time. They run pretty much 724 once you've finally built them, or can run 724. They both have relatively low physical land footprint per unit of capacity compared to renewables. They both are things the public is deeply distrustful about, at least some of the public. High levels of public distrust, high levels of debate, especially for CCS, a fear or a view that this is somehow a trick by which the fossil fuel industry is getting out of climate commitments. I often lump them together and call them the big uglies. My personal view is that it's a lot easier to solve the climate problem and also have low environmental impact if we use the big uglies, but that's the kind of thing we want to debate. So maybe I'd start with one of the questions we got, which was about small modular nuclear versus big, and turn it over to Ed. The question from the listener was, which multi-billion-dollar small modular reactor should Canada choose to replace CANDUs, and why?
So good question and good intro, David. I love the big uglies. And yeah, they are ugly fixes. And I'll get to the CCS side, work on that. And there's lots of controversy there. On nuclear, so I don't know specifically which unit we would use to replace CANDUs. I think back to the episode we had with Elizabeth May in late 2020. And what I do see is that I think SMRs represent the only viable future pathway for new nuclear in Canada. If you remember from that episode, and even Elizabeth, if I remember correctly, did not argue for taking existing nuclear offline or not going ahead with refurbishment of places like Darlington with its reactors. But I personally don't see a viable political pathway, not a technology pathway, but a viable political pathway to get a new 2 to 3 gigawatt plant done in this country. And recent polling that the Canadian Nuclear Association itself has done has shown that Canadians don't think positively of nuclear. And while support for climate action is high, support for nuclear as a climate solution is low. Where it does exist, it's places where nuclear already exists. And so what I think is, again, don't know the unit, but I think you could get up to a 300 megawatt SMR unit to produce high quality heat and electricity used as a bridge between the fuel and power sectors. And I think if it's going to happen anywhere, it's on a regional basis, not on a national basis. And I think in particular, it could happen in Saskatchewan, because Saskatchewan has a whole bunch of coal coming offline. they've got uranium mining. They can use Manitoba as a battery with hydro, but with all that coal coming offline, they're going to build out a lot of renewables. They'll need some base load, and that's where I think SMRs could play a role.
I'll have a quick answer and then turn it to Sara. So you're making a political claim, and I think the answer is the near term. You're right. Near term, we're not going to build any of this stuff. But on the other hand, I don't think we have a viable pathway to net zero that's political anyway. So the issue is when we realize that and the politics get serious, what do we do? And I want to push back a little bit. You've been kind of dismissive of big nuclear power. So Finland, which has a population of just 5 and a bit million, is just coming up to completing a long over budget and over cost, a 1.6 gigawatt reactor, which will help to dramatically continue decarbonization pathway. And that works fine in their grid. That's not that much bigger than Alberta. Mm-hmm. And the cost of that in dollars per unit of sort of continuous capacity, I had a funny back and forth where I got access to the costs of a bunch of local small solar here. The answer is it's about 3 times more expensive than that Finnish reactor. And of course, there are different capacity factors, different sizes, but the objective is we actually have to decarbonize at the scale of gigawatts. Mm-hmm. That's the scale we need, I'd say. Yep. Sara?
Yep.
Yeah, I think this is one where the political piece comes in a big way. And the other is sort of what you do about it. So, I mean, I guess one thing that concerns me is when SMRs are put forward as, here is what Alberta and Saskatchewan are doing on climate, right? And that's sort of some of the main investments that are happening at the exclusion of other things. And this is not a, theoretical concern. This is some of the things that we do see happening. So, are we going to get to a place where SMRs are working? I mean, all of the technologies, don't work and aren't competitive until they do. So to say, with 100% certainty that they're not, I wouldn't want to go that far. I'm not convinced that this is a case where, Canada should be leading versus saying, well, if some of the US companies develop these, sure, then we'll install them. Like what, is it really a smart place for us to be investing a lot of public funds? I'm very much not convinced on that point. And then I think otherwise, again, it just comes down to that question of to what extent, what fraction of the support goes there versus other places. And when you talk about, sort of firm power needs, I think we're guilty of this as well, having not come back to the geothermal topic this season. And I know that we need to do that next season. But it's interesting to me, like, I think there's good reasons to say that comparing head to head, nuclear and renewables is a very hard thing to do because they're providing quite different services to the power grid. But with geothermal and nuclear, it starts to get a bit closer to the type of resource that they are. And so there, again, I'm not at all convinced that that the nuclear makes sense versus geothermal when you're talking about how much power you might need in a place like Alberta.
Yeah, true, but people actually know how to build nuclear that works. There isn't
large
pathway.
Not SMR.
But large nuclear, but large is what we need. And there isn't, just to be clear, I don't know anybody who's looked at small modular. The only versions that work are when you have a lot of them in one place. And then you're back to big because of the fixed costs. I think the idea that, yes, maybe there's some Canadian thing where we install one in Saskatchewan. It'll be ridiculously high cost if it's a single unit. Remember, the nuclear we're actually building in the world is big nuclear because that's what works.
Yeah, but I think if you look at the federal parties right now, there isn't a single one that is going and advocate for large-scale nuclear as part of its platform. So I know you've said in previous episodes, David, we need civil society to create that space. But I also don't see any civil society appetite in Canada for large-scale nuclear. I do see some at the SMR level. And we'll see how it plays out. Because again, taking Saskatchewan, you're going to have a whole bunch of coal come offline. And Sara, to your point, I don't think it's nuclear versus renewables. I think it can be nuclear and renewables. I think renewables can take up 3,000 to 3,500 megawatts of share in Saskatchewan. I think we can build a line from Manitoba, but you're still going to need some of that firm power. And in the absence of something like an SMR, that's going to go to gas. And who knows if that gas, because CCS attached to combined cycle natural gas is on the more expensive side. I don't know if those economics are going to work.
It just brings me back to the point of like, okay, so then we should be building the renewables that, we know work today, and we can look at what percentage, public investment research and deployment funds should go into, say, the nuclear. But it shouldn't be put forward as this is the solution that we have, absent other things.
I don't think anybody is putting it forward, but it's clear that we actually do know how to build them. We have more nuclear than renewable globally. We know how to operate them. They work. They have low land footprint, low environmental footprint. I think it's important for those of us who are advocates for rational decision making to say that. Yes, I agree, it's politically not popular, but there's not a politically popular pathway to get to zero.
Yeah. We and talking about the other big ugly.
Yeah.
So I'm actually, and we just did this show with Sally Benson 2 weeks ago, but I'm bullish on CCUS. We're calling it CCUS now 2.0, and even more so after talking to Sally, because I agree. I think all credible pathways to net zero go through a ramp up of carbon capture. And at the risk, I actually, asked Sally, does she agree? And she said, yes, she agrees. And it has to play a role. And I think the public is going to accept it playing the role. The pushback to CCS, when you have landowners in this part of the world, this part of the country, who are just used to acid gas pipelines crossing their fields, they're used to taking gases out of the subsurface, putting them back in. I think the pushback is going to be a lot less. And if there is really any pushback. There is pushback to a topic that I know, Sarah, we're going to pick up in a moment, and it's links to the oil and gas industry. But we've got a world-class, engineering sector expertise. We got the people who can turn the wrenches, and we have the pore space. And now, actually, we've got good incentives for it to happen in Canada.
And we can turn it into beer. I have a fun one. So Emissions Reduction Alberta, which I sit on the board of, has funded a brewery in Alberta that is capturing CO2 from the fermentation process and using that to carbonate the beer. So I think, that clearly has got to have a good future.
Sign me up. Sign me up. I support that kind of capture.
I do think this evidence, there's a whole bunch of evidence from people who look at public acceptance or hatred of energy technologies and find that so much is based on local experience. So my sense is the idea that CCS is basically kind of like oil and gas technologies, is the same underlying hardware used for a different purpose. I feel like that's more likely to be accepted here. Whereas the idea that Ontario builds out another new nuclear in the existing site seems to be quite reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So just before this podcast this morning, I was talking to someone in the UK who was working to get carbon dioxide removal and sort of the non-biological permanent side more firmly on the COP26 agenda, but started in carbon capture. Really, she would be a great guest for a future episode, but really interesting. Like, it's hard to do CCUS in the UK. Just like Shell discovered, it's really hard to do CCUS in the Netherlands, even if this great global behemoth is headquartered there. Whereas, other forms of power, like nuclear, would the French accept another nuclear plant? Probably, because they've got such a history around it. Was Germany doing the right thing to take nuclear offline and start combusting lignite as in place of it? Absolutely the wrong thing. Absolutely the wrong thing for the climate. There is no tsunami risk, just about public perception. And so I come back to it. I just don't see the public license for nuclear here in Canada, large scale. I do see the public license for large scale carbon capture.
I think that's certainly true in the long run. I think the question is what happens in the short run. I think the question is what happens in the long run, and what happens when we begin to see the environmental footprints and trade-offs of some really large renewables, because I think those matter. And to me, our job is to decarbonize the planet, but to do it in a way that has the minimal environmental and social impacts. And those trade-offs really matter to me. There's lots of ways we could decarbonize the planet. You could do it almost all on biofuels if you wanted to, but it would be gigantic environmental impact of order of or bigger than the climate impact you're trying to solve. All right, Sarah, over to you.
All right, so I'll pick up on this CCS thread and come back to something that we didn't have a chance to discuss in detail in our CCS episode, which is EOR, or enhanced oil recovery. And so this is basically using CO2 in a process that is commonly done. So after kind of you get the majority or the first part of the oil out of a well that flows easily, you can use secondary, and then finally these tertiary recovery mechanisms. And so one of them is to pump down a gas like carbon dioxide and to force the oil out. And CCUS so carbon capture, where the carbon is then used for EOR, is one of the big places that we've seen carbon capture kind of take off to start. And this came up because it was specifically carved out of the recent CCUS funding that was announced by the Liberal government, or the tax exemption. I think Ed will have more of those details. And so the question that we got about that was, if EOR is less environmentally invasive than new green oil facilities, what is the trade-off in downstream emissions? Should we not actually allow EOR, CCUS, and should it not be carved out of the support, or what else could be done instead? So I'll turn it over to you, Ed, first on that one.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. And this is another, and lived this in the past several months. It's another example of, what does the data say versus what is the public perception? And to be clear, because we know government of Canada bureaucrats listen to our podcast, I am not saying in any way go and reverse your decision and scope EOR, CCS to EOR back in. I'm not saying that, but I am saying I think it was a nothing burger. So the question is, can CCS capturing a CO2 waste stream and then using that for enhanced oil recovery, while it's hard to wrap one's mind around, does it result in a net climate benefit or liability? To do that, you have to look at the LCAs that are produced through industry aggregated data and industry averages. It's an imperfect data collection system, but generally you can conclude that capturing CO2 from a point source and then sequestering it underground through EOR will produce fuels that have a net carbon intensity lower than conventional carbon intensity levels. But to be clear, and contrary to what some proponents will say, not dramatically lower. And on the depends side, a lot of it depends on your reservoir characteristics, the operator, the strategy that the operator uses. But it can be done, and generally on average, it does result in, on a net basis, lower life cycle carbon intensities. But that ship has sailed, because a bunch of my former colleagues, and I understand their concerns, wrote and said, this is a bad thing. It's going to result in new fields being developed, and we need to shut that oil in. And this is, making a very simplistic argument. And my counter is, I think we could use it to get carbon capture going. We've got the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line that is underused right now, and it's set up specifically for EOR. I think a keep it in the ground campaign doesn't work on a reservoir by reservoir basis, and it's dictated by global supply demand economics. And it would have helped to get carbon capture going more as a technology. That ship has sailed, and as I say, I'm not trying to reverse it, but overall, on a climate basis, I see it as a nothing burger.
All right. So nothing burger. David, how do you feel about that burger?
I don't agree with that. I think this was a major fumble by the CCS advocates over 15 years. So when I first got involved in CCS with Dave Hawkins, who was one of the, helped to write the Clean Air Act under Carter and was a leader of NRDC's, Natural Resource Defense Council's climate effort, we were focusing on CCS for electricity. And the idea is that was a clean environmental win. EOR, to be clear, context is important. There's a long history of EOR in the Permian field in the US, now about 50 million tons a year. That CO2 originally came from CO2 wells, like the Sheep Mountain, via the Sheep Mountain pipeline. That's the history. And the oil industry that wanted to keep doing EOR for producing oil wanted to find new sources. And there were some examples of sources like that were connected to the pipeline network, including some from fermentation, actually, a long time ago. And people who, when CCS was having trouble getting going, people said, well, it'll be easier if we can just do EOR since there's a money stream and that'll kind of help get CCS going. That decision, I think, was a fundamental PR mistake because it tied CCS tightly to the oil industry, which at least in the early days it wasn't. And it made it naturally and correctly a target for the environmental activists. And I think it was the right target for them. And I strongly disagree. Somebody's published a bunch of LCAs. I think Ed's claim about it, they're consistent LCA showing it's better. No. These depend on a bunch of stuff which are not simply done, that depend on assumptions about overall oil price elasticity and about what otherwise would have been done with the CO2. I don't think you can say as a general basis better. And I don't think you can say as a general basis that EOR have fields have lower environmental impact. That really depends on the specifics of essentially the productivity of the wells, of the permeability of the underlying formations. So I actually think the environmental community has it right on this one, and that those of us who wanted to see CCS used would have been a lot wiser if we had avoided getting into this CCS EOR mess.
So, David, just a quick rebuttal. I agree on public perception. And just like I talked about public perception and how that has damned large-scale nuclear in Canada. But I think, why don't we do what California has done and come up with a performance-based regulation, a CCS protocol? That's an addition to the low-carbon fuel standard there. It's got a highly stringent permanence protocol. And if you have performance-based criteria, then you can say, any CO2 sequestration project, whether it's for EOR or saline, just must comply and meet this standard to participate in the LCFS. So you're not saying this project is good, that project is bad. It's saying, come, and as long as you meet this performance standard, then you're eligible to feed into this market.
So, Ed, just to pick up on that, I think that there's a way to do something like that, which leaves you or doesn't force you to confront the EOR problem or not, right? And so that would be to say, if what you're trying to do with CCS support is deal with the fact that the carbon price that is, supposed to rise to $170 a ton by 2023, that there is some uncertainty with that, and that price is not, that price rise is not bankable. You could, rather than trying to get around it by creating this CCS specific incentive, look at ways to actually bring that certainty forwards. And so people have proposed, different ways to do this. There was a piece that came out recently by Blake Schaefer and Dale Bugan that pointed to one example with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And so basically what you're trying to do is say, similar to the argument for some kind of CCUS tax incentive, which is that, okay, the market, doesn't trust that the price is going that high. And so we can't use that future price to construct projects today. But if there was an insurance program that came and the government actually acted as an insurer and said, okay, I promise that I will pay you $170 a ton by 2030 for your CO2, whether or not the carbon price is in place, that addresses that challenge. And in a way that is not technology specific. And so, I agree with a lot of what David said. And I think that there's if you sort of dig into the policy details, there's a reason to be concerned about including EOR in the CCS tax credit, and that's because of you're sort of applying different carbon prices to the different amounts of carbon. So if you're getting the higher price today for the CCS, for the carbon capture, but then you're using that to extract oil, which is then combusted and pays a lower carbon price, you're actually undermining the policy that you've put together. And so, I think again, like the CCS policy that's in place now is in place. But as we look forward, I think that there's actually a lot that Canada could do to bring that future price to today and to enable then whatever technologies they are, whether they're carbon capture and storage or other things, to compete on a more even playing field.
Sure.
Maybe keep this. I mean, if you spent the money, however it happened, to have a big facility like a cement plant capture CO2, the added cost, once that CO2 is captured and compressed, and putting it underground is very small. So this comes down to a social choice. Do I put it underground, or do I help start a new oil industry in Alberta? Because we don't have a CCS EOR industry in Alberta. I think the answer is for me as an Albertan in the long run, I don't want to create new oil industries in Alberta, because I think that digs us deeper into the social and environmental hole we're in.
Sure. And I agree. So like I say, I've made my case. I made my case prior to the feds making the decision. I've made my case here. The broader issue is getting to, well, if we agree that carbon capture is important, and this, folks, is a live discussion. There's a 90-day consultation window that just opened up at the beginning of last week. You too can have your say on how the Fed should design the CCUS tax credit, investment tax credit, if you want, because they need advice. So the key thing is, to your point, Sara, it's how do you actually create projects that can be financeable and bankable? So I like your idea of what is a guarantee. When I talk to industry, what they say is, anything that is pledged that far out that has political risk attached to it, like the $170 carbon price, that makes it very difficult for us to finance these capital intensive projects. The beauty about the tax credit is it has support from the two major parties in Ottawa right now who have a chance of forming a government, and especially if there is an election this fall, as we expect. So that for them has much greater political certainty attached to it, and therefore it makes the tax credit more resilient, and therefore projects more bankable. I will say, I think the feds, the Canadian federal government, made a mistake in choosing an investment tax credit where the benefit is all front end loaded, as opposed to a US style 45Q production tax credit, where we only pay, or the taxpayer only pays as those tons go into the ground and verified by a good monitoring, measurement, and verification protocol. That what we're saying is invest heavily, but then we take on the operating risk that your project doesn't operate. It's slight, but I would rather be only paying once those tons go in the ground.
Ed, I agree with that. I'd love to hear your answer to the following. In the end, CCS itself is not a good. What we need is to use it for something. And I think there's a lot of agreement among the three of us and more widely about what it's needed for. It's needed to deal with things like cement plants, some natural gas peakers, and some other heavy industry like steel. Those are projects we actually need to do, in my opinion. I think quite widely shared. How would it have been different if the federal government had sort of thought of CCS as just an internal technology, not a thing in itself, not a US, just how do we help get some actual big industrial projects that have big drops in emissions to happen? Focused on that.
Well, so the federal government's response is, we did that with the carbon price, and we committed to $170 a ton by 2030. The problem is, and Mark Jackard, one of our previous guests, has written a lot about this, carbon pricing only gets you so far, and that you've got no cement plant that I know of or no steel plant that is going to say, spend the capital on carbon capture to retrofit their plants based on the carbon price alone. What they might do is mothball a plant, but they're not going to retrofit a plant. That's when you need complementary policies and you need the regulations. So I would say they looked at it, and in the end, they came up with what some would call a boutique tax credit, only because policymakers were rightly convinced that we have to ramp up carbon capture to decarbonize heavy industry.
And to be clear, Ed, there is a way, I mean, the idea of some kind of insurance, this would also be a contract, which in theory could be, torn up just in the way, frankly, a tax credit could be torn up by a future government. I mean, there's good reasons that governments don't tear up contracts usually. We, of course, saw that happen in Ontario. But I think there are other ways to provide that bankability. I'll actually say that I think there's good reasons to make it an investment and not a production tax credit when you look at the different costs of capital for governments versus the private sector, right? So as long as they're putting the money out there, in theory, it's going to cost less if the government is the one that's doing that up front. So there's arguments for that as well, especially if if you want to say who's best placed to take the technology risk, maybe at this point, government is better placed to take that than the bankers. They're certainly better placed to take the policy change risk. And I think that is the key in a lot of these policies is like making sure that policy change risk sits with the government. So I think I'll move us along then to our electricity sector topic, because we got quite a lot of questions in there as well. So we've talked a number of times on the show about electricity, both how we generate electricity with lower carbon emissions, as well as the role of electricity in electrification to decarbonize other sectors. So what can we electrify to reduce emissions? And so we have quite a few questions under this umbrella, but I'll start us off with one around really a focus at home. And so this is quite relevant given the announcement that came out from the NDP recently that they pledged a net zero Alberta electricity system in 2035, and so we got a question about what would this look like, including, where does winter supply come from? What else would this system look like in 2035 that would be net zero? So David, over to you to start us off on that.
I think it's hard sometimes to imagine just how hard a problem this is. The fact is, the peak demand of around 10 gigawatts is something that actually still has a winter peak. You're right, Sarah, that it's gradually changing. It's winter peaked. And on winter nights, on a still winter night, there's obviously no solar and there's basically no wind. So how on earth are you generating that? My view is the chance of doing that by batteries, which is the kind of thing that people are excited about, the chance of doing it by sort of lithium ions installed in people's power walls at scale at a reasonable price by 2035 is not quite zero. Maybe there'll be some incredible battery breakthrough that makes it unbelievably cheap to manufacture batteries and scale, but I think very, very low odds of that. So what are we going to do to generate that power at night? I think that there are really a limited set of options. One option is much more use of hydro and building actually more pumped hydro into the existing hydro systems. There are options for doing compressed air energy storage, which is a storage system that actually can be built using kind of oil patchy technologies. Have been done a few places, and there's some evidence that can be cheaper. I think it's conceivable you could do it by underground hydrogen storage, but I think in general, the idea that you go from electricity to hydrogen and back to electricity at scale really doesn't make much sense. So there really aren't too many options. My view is that that's where the conversation about doing some nuclear or doing some CCS, natural gas with CCS for peaking makes sense, because just adding solar and wind will not deal with that problem.
Yeah, Ed, any thoughts on that?
Sure. So, David, I agree. I think, power walls at the individual household level will play a small role. As much as I think it would be cool to have one here to couple with the 4 kilowatt system I have on my roof, it will be small. It's boutique. You've called it green bling. People may want to go ahead and do that anyway for a whole bunch of reasons. I think storage, and more than just hydro and pumped hydro and compressed air, I think battery storage could play a significant role coupled with some of the big solar projects that we're seeing going ahead. Now, I will say right now, it's tough with economics to make that work and make your projects bankable or financeable, like we were talking about CCS earlier. But look at just a few years ago with pure solar projects in the province. No one had thought you could go ahead and build a 465 megawatt project like the Traverse Solar Project on an unsubsidized basis. And now it has achieved final investment decision. It's going ahead on an unsubsidized basis and by that, to be clear, it's getting some of the carbon value that it is afforded under the TIER program, but it's not getting governments to write a check saying, here is 10% of your capital costs, we'll offset that. And I think the costs, the economics on storage could come down in a similar way. To get there, it did take government incentive. There is a great wind power production incentive in the 2000s that really helped large-scale wind to get a hold. The feds have done the same with $1 billion fund that is tailor-made for projects that couple storage. I think we'll be getting there in a few years as well on an unsubsidized basis once we just cross through this next tranche of getting our costs down.
So I don't want to overclaim my own publications and effort, but I really don't buy this. So I think batteries there's some intrinsic reasons. So I agree about the incredible rate of learning in solar and wind, but batteries have a particular ratio of peak power to stored energy that is deep in the chemistry and physics of the way batteries are made. And it's not like we're a little ways away. Batteries for diurnal, day-to-day storage in some places are quite not that far from being economic. But batteries for seasonal are of order 1 or 2 orders of magnitude away. And even people I know who are the leading developers of batteries don't really see them playing in that role. So you say it's a little bit hard, but it's I think there really is a difference. So 10 years ago, we could see what wind was doing. We could begin to see what solar was doing. It wasn't crazy to imagine 0.5 gigawatt scale projects. But I think it's easy to just say, oh, everything just gets cheaper. Well, no, I think there are reasonable things one can foresee based on the economics and chemistry and physics of the way these things work that make it pretty unlikely that batteries are going to be the thing that manages the seasonal storage problem.
Yeah, and that seasonal piece I think is a big one. And David, you mentioned the compressed air storage. I was actually interested to see that California is going ahead, I believe, with a couple of larger compressed air storage projects installed by a Canadian company. So I think there's some interesting things in that space. And then I think the other one too is looking at a net zero target, not an absolute zero target. The role for natural gas for those few days when it is very still and very cold in the winter, that can still play a big role without adding much in the way of emissions as well too. And I think that's an important piece that a piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle there is interties, and we've also talked about that before on the show quite a bit. But we did get a couple questions there about, do we think we should go east-west or north-south? And then also, how do they get built? So is it about making a business case for merchant lines? Is it AESO and WEC getting together? Is it the feds doing something? This question actually was asked in terms of, what should climate advocates be advocating for and to who? So maybe starting with you, Ed, and then to David, where is a line going to get built and how is it going to get built if you look into your crystal ball?
So at the risk of scooping ourselves, I think the three of us will agree on the need for strategic grid interties. On those how questions, are they running east-west or are they running north-south? We might disagree. But let me just talk at the motherhood and apple pie level. It is critically important for a national electrification strategy. And we know politically the government of Canada is interested in a national approach. It's about, this is the tricky part, enabling interjurisdictional transfers of electricity between provinces, between territories that largely have an abundance of hydro capacity. Looking at BC, looking at Manitoba. So there's no reason why BC and Manitoba can't be to that question, like hydro batteries for Alberta and for Saskatchewan, respectively, for those provinces that are struggling more to decarbonize their grids. The challenge is, I don't see anyone working on it, especially in Western Canada, in a serious way. I think we've got a complete lack right now of good technical, economic, and policy research around it. We don't have enough people pushing governments on it, and we're fighting fiefdoms. And those fiefdoms are provinces, crown corps, utilities, and I don't see anyone championing this when I look around inside the federal cabinet. And until we get that push coming from a whole range of industries, civil society, stakeholders, I think it's going to remain at the motherhood and apple pie level, and we'll never get to the how.
Well said. I guess I think that if you want to decarbonize the North American grid, which of course is actually 4 grids, East, West, Texas, and Quebec are the 4 separate grids. If you want to decarbonize it, you have to do it with big interties. I think there's no plausible pathway otherwise. I think it's natural for Canadians to want a pan-Canadian strategy, but I think that simply isn't economics, and economics does work. My view is that what Canada has that the US doesn't is a huge amount of hydro as a fraction of our total capacity. And that hydro can be used as a battery, which is fundamental to enabling broader decarbonization. And there's a huge monetary value to Canada and to the individual provinces in monetizing that, in making deals with the Americans, where fundamentally America has, for some renewables, more cheap renewable resource for solar, but Canada has more hydro. And there's an obvious deal to be made in decarbonization. And that deal, I think, fundamentally means the lines mostly run north-south, which makes them shorter lines. The idea you're going to run a full east-west line is a kind of great, all pulled together Canadian thing, but it is very long distance for relatively low capacity, and it doesn't deal with the fundamental asymmetries of power, that we have more solar in the summer and in the south, and we have this huge amount of hydro in BC and Quebec and Manitoba in the north. That's the obvious way the line should go.
I think there's a big political element to it. And it's interesting that the US is, they're going through this discussion right now, right? I think I saw a quote from Cheryl LaFleur, who was formerly on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, making the point that, there's just a huge role for the federal government in getting these lines built, in that, the US didn't build an interstate highway system by kind of the federal government saying, oh, it would sure be nice if, there were some roads that everybody could drive across to get from one place to another. And I think that these transmission lines are similar. So, with that in mind, I do think there is a big role for the federal government in Alberta, in Canada, to just step in and say, well, we're going to build some of these, between, say, BC and Alberta, and we come just, bearing gifts. Like, here's the line. You don't really have to pay for it, and we're going to do it. And then that is linked together with some of the north-south lines, say, coming down through BC into WEC as well. So maybe I'm sort of splitting the difference between those two. But it's I think really a heavy federal hand, and somebody like the Infrastructure Bank does, in theory, have money to do this. So let's I guess we should all get on the phone and tell the Infrastructure Bank that that's what we want to see maybe going forward.
But the problem is the Infrastructure Bank isn't always welcome. And there is active resistance to infrastructure bank investments in Alberta and how those investments are being made. They don't want infrastructure bank investments in renewables, because the government of Alberta is concerned about transmission, and they want infrastructure bank money in to decarbonize fossil fuels. So I know the irony is we've got this massive piggy bank sitting there that is underused right now, but those of us who want to work on this can't even tap into it for this part of the country.
Yeah, I agree. This is where it just seems painful. It's just getting a little more local. BC and Alberta, the obvious answer to the question, Sarah, you started with, of how first order way with existing technology, how we're dealing with nighttime winter Alberta, the obvious answer is a much stronger intertie with BC. So we're giving them wind when we got access wind, and we're getting it back time shifted from hydro. That's the obvious deal.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I'll turn things over to you, Ed, to take us to the last section.
Thank you. This has been fun. So this last question is a blue sky question. And Sarah, maybe I'll go to you first. So imagine that you are suddenly anointed energy versus climate czar. And by energy versus climate czar, you can do anything. You have absolute power in, let's draw a geographic boundary around it, in Canada, to get us on track to our net zero commitments. What would you do?
Well, first, I guess I would bask in my ultimate power as energy dictator.
Would you still be our friends if you're?
I don't know. I guess I would get a lot of calls from people saying, "You should do this. You should do that." It would be fun. I think the answer to what I would do is I would do a lot of things, right? And I think that's maybe one of the common themes that comes through our show. I mean, I guess the one that we just talked about, I would certainly build some inner ties. So I think looking at all of these enabling technologies and enabling backbone infrastructure that might be missing, that we could accelerate, adoption of a range of technologies with different options, I think is one that's important. I would certainly also look at, how do we find, I thought it was interesting, the IEA net zero report that I don't think we've talked much about, but one of the things that was in there was a number of behavioral changes that the IEA sees as important in the shift to net zero. And I think when we hear about behavioral changes, people often feel kind of like, I don't want anyone to tell me how to live my life and what to do. But I think the key to unlocking a lot of those behavioral changes is finding ways for people to do things that take less energy and also make their life better, right? And so I think, you hear that a lot when people talk about building net zero homes that are more comfortable because you don't have this super hot or super cold air blowing in your face. Certainly looking at a range of transportation options and matching transportation needs to the, what you're trying to do. So, driving an enormous truck a mile, a kilometer, 2 kilometers to the grocery store when you could be taking an e-bike instead, the latter might be lower emissions and might also make you happier. And so I think another thing that I would do is really, maybe I would create an office of lifestyle changes or something that looks for ways to match what we need to do with what is going to make people's lives better. And in general, just I think starting from the perspective that there are a lot of sort of entrenched ways of doing things within our energy system that may not necessarily be the best, but that align with the incentives that we have in place, and looking at those.
Great. Now, let's hear from David, but I will say the Office of Lifestyle Changes sounds like a conservative nightmare.
No. It's exactly what they want, is to have that, because it'll be red meat that allows them to win the next election.
There you go. I gotta give it a better name. The Office of Making People Happier and enabling them to make choices, right? Because I think that's the other thing is our
chocolate rations have gone up. Chocolate rations have gone up again, folks. David, what do you think?
Nobody wants me as czar. That's pretty clear.
It's a good thing we're not actually politicians.
I mean, it's actually interesting to ask me that question this morning, because I got an email this morning related to people at the very top of the US administration realizing that they don't have a coherent plan and they need some small group of people who can more rationally get to a net zero plan, because they just don't have the kind of science advice they need. And I want to pick up there. I think it's easy to bash politicians, and they deserve lots of bashing. But I think that a central thing that especially actually Canada lacks is really high quality technical advice to government to allow them to make these decisions. And I think there are specific methods we could use to do that. So as you've heard a bunch on our debates on this show, I think Sara and I broadly agree that in a small country like Canada, some real industrial policy makes sense. That is, it makes sense to actually make some decisions that it's this winner and not that winner, to call some winners. But it only makes sense to call winners if you have a really robust, independent process to make those decisions. It doesn't make sense to call winners in this kind of very politicized system we have now, with comparatively weak analytical advice flowing into the political decisions. So I think if you're really going to do it, you need to think about a quite new kind of entity for really high quality technical advice. There are reasons that current academia really doesn't do good energy advice. It's people publish papers in this academic mode, but they often don't have access to the core consulting information that tells them what thing really costs. The key thing to know in making energy decisions is what are the actual costs now and the near-term expectations of costs. And then you need kind of energy and economic modeling to look at the trade-offs between things. Building those models isn't that hard, but they only are as good as the information going into them. And you need really high quality cost data going into them. I think you can imagine a system, and I think you'd want to have it decentralized a little bit. You can imagine a system that does that in a way that has really top people with a well-organized system that produces answers to specific questions that politicians can use in making these decisions. And I think that's the only pathway I see in a democracy to really allow them to do this. And you need some somewhat political firewall between this advisory thing and what the politicians actually do. But in the end, if we are remotely serious about decarbonizing by 2035 or 2040, which we are not now, you need a level of hard decisions that we are not seeing. And you need an advisory process of the kind we've had decades and decades ago, but not now, that allows that to be politically credible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that. If I could pick up on that one, David, because we actually have had that twice in Canada. We've had the National Roundtable, NRT on the environment and the economy. And so I know it was imperfect. More recently, the Fed set aside $25 million and used that as a catalyst to found the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, which is soon to be headed up my old friend Rick Smith. And it's supposed to give that impartial outside advice with the firewall set up. The problem with these functions is even then it's got, set up by federal funding. Yeah. It struggles to get attention with policymakers. And the moment it comes out with something that smacks of any kind of criticism of government, then government stop listening. And it becomes just another bunch out there and lumped together. And no offense to my CICC friends, but that's the problem with the model. What I like, and if I were energy czar, first I'd build a time machine and I'd work with my physicist friends to build one. We said we were working on one.
Sarah and I are actually going to work on that late this summer.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get that, along with the teleportation too. Okay.
That's good. I'll walk around with a lab coat and a clipboard, and then I'll provide the beer at the end. But we should have been implementing serious policy decades ago. So the time machine could help us reverse that. But I really think, and to your point about real industrial policy makes sense. So I agree. So you can include me in that group of supporters, but I think we should really focus on what matters. And I'll actually give a shout out to Bill Gates in his book, because his book was about that. And it came from good advice and from folks like you and Ken Caldera, David. But how do we get electricity? How do we get around? How do we stay cool? How do we stay warm? How do we make steel, cement, and plastics? How do we grow things? Focus on that. And then frankly, like let the other tune out the rest of the bits. And so I would disagree with your point, Sara, because on the lifestyle changes, there's this expression, if we all do a little, it adds up to a lot. And at the risk of infuriating a good friend of mine who just may be listening to this after the fact, I say if we all do a little, it adds up to a little. It doesn't make a difference. Just focus on those big hammers.
Yeah, so actually on that one, Ed, I don't disagree with you. And I think it's really about, much like the climate challenge in other areas, it's about what is the systemic change that you need to enable individuals to make different choices, right? So there is a small group of people who are going to, go to great lengths to change their consumption patterns. But for most people, it's about what's easily available, right? And so it's what are the changes that we make to the regulations that sort of direct companies to produce products that sort of meet our climate goals. So things like, extended producer responsibility, for example, where it's not about getting every single person to think about how much trash they're individually generating, but changing the underlying system so that it becomes easier to change their footprint.
Just a few words on, I think, a distinction between the roundtable process you mentioned, which I think is really important, and the kind of thing I'm talking about. The roundtable process is basically about bringing senior representatives of different stakeholder groups together to talk. That's an important thing, but is different from an analytical core. I'm talking about something where you hire like 15 or 20 people who are some of the best energy analysts around. You want to hire them full time. You got to pay them several $100K a year to get people like that. And you need to give them a budget to do some consulting, because in each little industry I find, like whether it's cement or some little bit of CCS or something, there's some guy or gal who's like really knows where the body's buried, who has a multi-client consulting shop who really knows what stuff costs. You got to be able to, those people won't give you that information for free. You got to pay them. And you need to have a structure to do that. And that kind of structure that actually does the modeling is key. And just bringing people together doesn't do it. If you'll give me a second, there's two places I've seen different versions of this in the US. So the US has the National Academy process, which is still more like representative. A bunch of big shots come together, they're experts, we talk a little, we make something, but we don't do new analysis. The US has a really interesting, mostly secret, most highly classified process called JASON. I've been invited to a JASON meeting. It's really fascinating. And these people are some of the best technical brains there are in the world, who get a chance to critique and comment on and sometimes constructively do stuff in the US military world. And what's really interesting, at least in the old days, the JASONs would meet for a few weeks and do nothing else but work together on a project or two. And they invented a bunch of new stuff, and mostly they critiqued bad things. In fact, the Pentagon Papers, many of you will have heard about, was essentially an early version of a JASON project related to it. And I think we need a version like that for energy if we want to make these decisions.
Yep. Well, I would agree. And maybe on that note, we can wrap up. So we're at time. This has been fun. And we're at the end of season 2. Thanks to David and Sara. I've really enjoyed working with you these past several months and look forward to working with you again when we come back for season 3 in September. But in the meantime, we are looking for your feedback. And this is really important, folks. We want to know how we can make the show better. So keep an eye out for an audience survey. They'll be coming to your inboxes sometime this summer. We'll bounce some ideas off you, and please let us know. We know we've got we think a pretty good dedicated audience. Help us to make the show better. So you can give us that feedback anytime at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. We'll see you in a few months. Take care.
Thanks to you, Ed.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnicescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.